Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad to be here. Glad talking with you again. Like Wendy said, my name's Larry Figart. I've been working with Extension for 20 years now, but prior to that, before that, I was a forester for 19 years with the state forestry division. So I'm kind of typecast to trees. So today we're going to talk about I've seen a couple of different titles for this, and we'll kind of talk about why it is what it is, the title, but it's called Creeping Up the Coast: Climate Drivers of Florida's Changing Landscape. And so change is a big part of the is going to be a big part of this talk here today. When I originally gave this presentation, it was at the Northeast Florida Master Gardener Conference, and I presented it in tandem with Dr. Savannah Berry, who's our Sea Grant agent in Northeast Florida. She couldn't be here today. She had another conference she was speaking at, and so at the end, I'm gonna be also be giving her portion of the presentation, but not as well as what it would have been if she would have been here with us. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to discuss the changes in Florida's climate that are occurring now, what we can expect in the future. And I didn't know how to say this because it wasn't out of any research or any document. These were just ideas that I've kind of been thinking about for a while, ideas for how we manage our landscapes in nowadays climate. And then we're going to, at the end, this was Savannah's part, we're going to put it all together with a real Florida example that's currently existing. So I'm at the beginning part of this presentation, I'm drawing a lot of different information from a lot of different sources. So the next couple of slides are from the fourth National Climate Assessment, Chapter 19, which deals specifically with the Southeast. So the first thing I wanted to talk about, some of the effects of climate change that we're feeling now, is the number of hot days and warm nights have increased. Now you might look at this upper chart and it's number of days above 95 degrees, and you might say, hey, it's been warmer. And that's probably accurate until when we talk specifically Florida, and I kind of highlighted Florida here a little bit. Florida in itself, a lot of the further north you get, it's less of a percent change in heat. But in Florida, we are getting more temperatures, more days above 95 degrees. But the other thing that is kind of an interesting thing is that the number of warm nights above 75 degrees is increasing as well, and it's increasing kind of at a high rate. And so you might think, okay, just we have to, we can't have our windows open anymore. We have to have the air conditioning um, on at night when we didn't used to. But think about things that temperature, evening temperatures and blooming affect. Like tomatoes are a big, are something that immediately comes to mind. When it gets too warm at night, the tomatoes stop blooming. So that's just another thing to kind of think about. Somebody, I heard it in the chat earlier, historic chill hours were getting warmer. Winter is getting warmer. I've got four different examples, but this actually comes from our own FAWN, Florida Automated Weather Network from the University of Florida. And so these are four different scenarios. The first one is Lake County, kind of in the middle of the state. This orange line is the historic chill hours. And what chill hours are, if you don't know, is temperatures below 45 degrees. hours of temperature below 45 degrees. And the reason we measure it is there's a lot of our fruit and a lot of things that bloom that need to accumulate a certain amount of chill hours before they bloom. And so our historic chill hours are out here, but in the last 2 years at least, um, in Lake County, our chill hours have been much less than historical. This season was 154 hours. Last season was only 181 hours. So our winters, at least in Lake County, let's see what it is the rest of the state. This is Alachua County, and they're used to getting historic chill hours of 745 chilling hours, chilling units. This season was 464 hours, and last season was 415 hours. So much lower than what is historic. So what about a little bit further south? DeSoto County, historic chill hours, they would get, I was amazed by this figure, 302 historic, historically get enough chill hours, but this season and the past season, it's been 115 and 58, much less than what's historic. And then in Glades County, it's kind of interesting. Early on in the winter, they approached to where they were looking like they might have reached their typical historic chill hours, but historically they'd get 188 hours, and um, they got this season 42 and last season 105. So basically, for our landscapes, it's not getting as cold in the winter as it typically does. And that's going to be a big impact for a lot of things. So here's another slide out of that climate assessment. And I can explain this in two different ways. And so whichever, the way they explained it kind of was a little wonky to me, but it's that the freeze free season is getting longer. And so I kind of had to think of what does freeze free season. So at the in the spring till the fall, so from the last freeze in the spring till the first freeze in the fall, those periods are actually getting longer. Another way you could look at that would be the amount of time where we have a freeze season is actually getting shorter. So from the first freeze in the fall till the last freeze in the spring, that period of time is actually getting shorter. So that's throughout the Southeast. So what does that imply for things in our landscape? First, we're going to talk a little bit about invasives. And so this kind of sets up for the next slide, but we can kind of group our invasives to north, invasives in the northern part of the state, invasives in the middle part of the state, and invasives in the southern part of the state. And if, and so I'll start up here. So this is recently, and if we think the different colors, the tan is the northern range of the northern species. The pink or mauve is the range of the middle species, and then the red is the range of the southern invasive species. And if we can look at three different scenarios, if our climate warms 2 degrees, like everybody is hoping it doesn't get any worse than that, but we still get a movement northward of all three different the ranges of northern, mid, and southern invasive species actually start to shift to the north. If temperatures get rise 4 degrees Celsius, it's even worse. So we start to get our northern invasive species all the way up into middle Georgia, all through South Carolina, up into Arkansas. And then actually in Jacksonville, where I am, North Florida, we actually start to see some of those mid-species invasives. And then if temperatures increase 6 degrees Celsius, we start to see some of the southern invasive, the northern range of the southern invasives actually start to hit into parts of North Florida. And the whole panhandle starts to see some of those invasives that we would have just thought historically have been in the middle of the state. And so this is actually the driver for me coming up with this presentation because in throughout my forestry career, we always thought, Brazilian pepper was a middle state invasive species, maybe as high as Merritt Island. But this is a picture. I was actually driving down one of the roads in Jacksonville. It's a couple of years ago. That's my car right there. But I was stopped at a stoplight and I looked off to my right and I said, "Look at that pretty holly tree." And I kept on looking, kept on looking. I said, "That's not a holly." And I pulled over and got out. And it was actually, you can see the size of this. This tree has been here a long time, but this was a Brazilian pepper, the first one that I had seen in Duval County. And it's actually, Brazilian pepper now is fairly common in in Jacksonville and northeast Florida and Duval County. So the next couple of slides I want to look at, and so those were our invasives. They're creeping up. That's the whole creeping up the coast kind of thing. They're starting to creep up the coast. But what about our native, some of our native trees and shrubs? And so this was the next couple of slides taken from this study. There's a whole group of folks here involved in this, and what they did is they looked at a lot of the native species, several, 20 or 30 native species in Florida, and I'm only picking 6 to look at. So we'll just go ahead and look at those. And so this would be the Upper Peninsula, and they kind of grouped it into areas. So the Upper Peninsula, Fagus grandiflora is American beech, and Quercus falcata is southern red oak. And this is their native range currently now. So these numbers are in kilometers squared. And so, and then the T1, T2 is with 1 degree Celsius rise in temperatures or a 2 degrees Celsius rise in temperature. T1 plus 1W means that rise primarily takes place in the winter, like what we were talking earlier, or T2W is where that rise takes place primarily in winter temperatures. So with all these scenarios at 2 degrees temperature rise, we no longer have American beech in the state of Florida. At 1 degree Celsius temperature rise, it loses 36% of its natural range today. Then if we go to southern red oak, 1 degree temperature rise, it loses 26, modeled to lose 26% of its current range. And then if it's 2 degrees warming and where it primarily takes place in the winter time, it can lose up to 98%. Very little southern red oak in Florida. So that's kind of the northern trees. So the warm temperate, that's kind of middle Florida. And so these trees are longleaf pine and live oak. And so just as you can see, as things get warmer, live oak starts to lose, or excuse me, longleaf pine starts to lose its native range in the state of Florida to where 2 degrees Celsius increase primarily taking place in the winter, we can lose up to 43% of a keystone species in our ecosystems. And then live oak, it's not as bad for live oak, but up to 13% of loss of habitat for, or not loss of habitat, but loss of a population of live oak. And so now in South Florida and further south, it's kind of a different scenario. And so this is gumbo limbo, and this is South Florida slash pine. So what you see is with increases in temperature, range is actually expanding. So these trees are actually migrating further north to where instead of a loss in the number of species, actually increase the number of population in the state of Florida to where with gumbo limbo actually increasing into Northeast Florida, 124% increase in the population size of gumbo limbo. So I thought that was, I'm setting you up for some things that we're going to talk about in plant migration. So come to will plants and trees migrate? I couldn't help but use this graphic. I thought it was funny. All the trees with their suitcases and luggage moving onward and upward. And so how do they do that? A lot of times it's seed dispersal. Naturally, it's seed dispersal. So some studies estimate 80, 90 meters per year. Another study I looked at states that it's happening a little faster, up to 100 meters per year, especially for some of those more northern species. So going back to the slides where certain trees were exiting the state of Florida, they weren't becoming scarce. They were actually moving further north. And so there's just some interesting terms when we talk about plant migration. And one of them is called, it's the leading edge and the trailing edge. And so it's kind of the northern range and the southern range of those plants or trees as they move northward. And so they can look differently. So the leading edge, the more northern edge, it's usually species of trees and they all move kind of at different rates, not communities of forest. And so they start to look a little different as they expand at their own rates. And it's usually younger trees that produce more seeds, but they don't reproduce as fast because they have to get to a certain age before they start reproducing. Um, and while not the case in Florida because we don't have that much elevation, but in addition to moving in northward, it can also be moving up in elevation where there is elevation. It can be moving up the mountainside versus moving northern into colder climates. And then the trailing edge, it's kind of the old declining holdouts. And they're a little bit more stressed because the climate is warming. But the interesting thing is they are, versus the leading edge was the younger seed producers. These are the mature seed producers. And the trees that are left there tend to have a little bit of advantage because maybe they've learned to adapt a little bit to the heat. Um, maybe they have some genetics that allows them to withstand the heat a little bit more. Um, and so there's some implications for that in a little bit. So that's natural plant migration. There's also a term that's called assisted migration, and that's where we kind of help things along a little bit. And it's kind of controversial, and we'll talk about that in a sec. But three different kinds. One is called assisted population migration, and that's just where, say, and the example I have in a little bit is where emerald ash borer has taken out a population of ash trees, and so you kind of can fill in with other species that are in that would naturally occur there, you kind of fill in with those species. So that's assisted population migration. Assisted range expansion is just moving trees a little bit further just beyond their current range. But then assisted species migration, and this is probably the most controversial, but this is where you actually take trees and move them a lot further north, a lot farther than their natural, what they would do naturally in natural migration. But where that's kind of reserved for is some of the trees that are very rare, some of the trees that are endangered, some of the trees that and plants that we can't, we don't want to lose. So where assisted migration might be the only way to save those species. So these are just some examples, current examples. This slide, it's kind of blurry, but this is actually in the Forest Service in Minnesota, where emerald ash borer took out a population of ash trees. So where invasive species love a vacuum. So where invasive species were encroaching, the U.S. Forest Service filled it in with trees that would naturally occur in that range, but they kind of assisted the migration of those trees into those voids. But sometimes when we think about assisted species migration, one of the things that's being talked about is with our Florida toria. Um, in Florida, they're endangered. They've got some disease issues, especially as the climate changes. But some of the larger species known in the United States were actually brought up for the nursery trade in North Carolina. So is that ethical to take, is that something reasonable to take a species that are endemic to Florida and move them to North Carolina so that they survive with climate change? So the revised Forest Service policy is that must be informed by successful performance. So they have to test it a lot, and then justified by research, justified by climate model projection. They need to be intentional and think about it very diligently. So I've got this. I'll leave this up here for a little bit. But podcasts are cool things. I just happened to be, I follow this podcast Stuff You Should Know, and just I'm mowing the grass, and all of a sudden a podcast comes on about plant migration. So I knew I was getting ready for this. So that's just if you want to take a picture of that QR code and you can listen to this podcast. It was a great podcast on plant migration. So I heard a lot of folks talk about, even in the chat earlier before we started, about um, our hardiness zones. And these are actually cool. We think about hardiness zones, and it's basically talking about minimum temperatures, minimum winter temperatures. So this is historic climate plant hardiness zones, but the Washington Post actually modeled what would our hardiness zones look like in the future. And so they kind of predicted, and this is what we're seeing now, is that actually earlier this year, the USDA plant hardiness zones actually shifted, and we all got into different zones. But then, as climate change, or excuse me, as the warming climate increases, um, you know, 30, 40 years from now, zone 9 actually starts creeping up into Georgia, and hardly any of the state of Florida is zone 8 anymore. And then towards the end of the century, it creeps up a little bit further. And so where almost all the state is in 9 or 10, and hardly any zone 8. So this is where we come in to kind of Larry's thoughts on how we adapt our residential landscapes. And so there's a couple of different things. Number one, we talked about chill hours, and I heard y'all talk about it, is to really make sure that the chill hours for the fruit trees that we buy can be met where we live. We don't want to buy something that needs more chill hours than what we can provide it, and so it will flower. And
Okay,
then,
Larry, I got a question on chill hours.
okay,
And I think this can be answered through fawn, but what time period do we use to calculate the chill hours and the historic chill hours? So I think usually we look at the historic chill hours in a 10-year block. Does that sound right to you? And then normally it's isn't it November to March is the months that we look at?
so I don't know
October.
what their dates for, when they started the historical, and they did talk about that it shifted a little bit historically. We aren't, everything did um shifted some of the historic average. I could go back and figure it out, and you could look through fawn, but they measure October 1st through April 25th.
Okay.
That's what.
And then another question before we get going on, about someone's asking about using shade cloth to mitigate the heat and what
I'll talk
percentage of
about that.
shade cloth. You're going to talk
I'll
about
I'll
that?
talk a
Okay.
little bit about that. So
All
if
right.
if I don't, um, call me in on it, and we'll do it again.
Okay, and the everybody else's who put questions in the question box, I know that that's the direction that Larry's going to, so we'll get there. All right, thanks, Larry.
Okay. So it's kind of how do we adapt our residential landscapes? So, make sure our chill hours can be met. And then I hate this bothered me to say this because change is hard, but I've got people, so the standard phone calls we get now, used to be how can I grow peaches? Now it's how can I grow mangoes in North Florida. And so I'm still, we got to be careful about cold temperature, but some of the colder, hardy, tropical, cold tolerant tropical fruit, think about bringing some of those a little bit further. Like our ag agent, Steve Genevine, loves to grow bananas in his yard in Clay County, and he does very well with them. So, so basically, I think what I'm saying is that what we traditionally grew as fruit might be changing, and we kind of have to adapt with that as well. Oh, um, and so experiment with trees and shrubs from a warmer hardiness zone. Consider and I'm a bad example of this, but consider not using some plants from more temperate zones. In other words, look south if you want to try and experiment. And so when I had to go out to Tallahassee and then Leon County, I loved the fact that they had these deciduous magnolias, these big flowering magnolias, and I thought for sure we're on the same latitude. I can grow that in Jacksonville, and it failed miserably. So I guess what I'm saying is again, rather than look north for new plants, kind of look south for new plants to try. One that I'm very excited about is Simpson Stopper, growing that, in Northeast Florida when we used to not be able to do that. And so this is, I should, um, putting shade cloth, that's definitely one way to do it. And then the other way, since I'm a forester, planting trees to add shade to kind of shield some of the heat effects for some of our more heat intolerant plants. And then also seek out heat tolerant flowers and vegetables. Um, Okra is one of them, peppers. things like that. And then always starting a little earlier than what we have been starting. I typically start my tomatoes at the end of February, and I'm going to have to start doing my tomatoes maybe in the middle of January. So then also, this is kind of a double-edged sword. Be ready to water more during drought. So our droughty season is going to increase, and usually in Florida, that's March, April, May. So we're gonna have more droughty periods, but then the opposite, it's gonna be feast and famine. Come summertime, come our tropical season, we'll probably get more water than we usually get. So be ready to water more during droughts, but be ready to deal with more water at other periods of time. So then this is something I changed when I originally gave this, I had coconut palm on there, but it's something just to be mindful of the plants that we use and think about their not their invasiveness now, but maybe their invasiveness in the future. So for instance, the IFAS assessment, and I'll go over what that is if you haven't ever used the IFAS assessment. They've taken many different plants and rated them with they're predicting their invasiveness, so to speak. So um I I have on here mango. So in South Florida, mango is actually listed as caution. It's a caution plant, may be recommended, but manage it to prevent its escape. But in North Florida, the IFAS assessment deems mango is not a problem species. And the reason they list it that way is because typically it's been too cold to grow mango. However, folks are successfully now growing mango all the way up to Jacksonville in Northeast Florida. So just think about, you know, future, like I said, future invasiveness. Well, just because it's not invasive now, maybe it will be invasive in the future. So maybe some of these caution plants are not what we want to be planting. So now I promised a real Florida example. So this is where typically Savannah would carry on, but um, oops. So we're going to talk a little bit about the creeping up the coast of mangroves in Florida, and this just blows my mind when I think about it, and um, I can see examples. And matter of fact, this weekend I saw examples. So just a little primer on mangroves. We typically have three different species of mangroves in the state of Florida, and their adaptations for living in salty and brackish water. The red mangrove exudes salt at its roots. The black mangrove is the most salt tolerant, and it actually exudes salt through the glands on the back of the leaf. I tested that this weekend, and I picked a leaf and I licked it, and sure enough, it was salty. And then the white mangrove excretes salt through the leaf, and then it's also got thick and succulent leaves. And so they also adapt to living on the coast with their roots. They've got aerial roots that help them to take in oxygen so that they can respire, kind of call them little snorkels if you want. And then they also have what are called lenticels, and they're actually portals to where air exchange can take place within the trunk of the tree. So they allow air and gas exchange to occur in the trunk. And then this is one of the cool adaptations of mangroves, and it's called vivipary. And it's actually where the seeds germinate while they're still on the tree. So it's not like the seeds fall and then they germinate. They germinate while they're still on the tree. And what somebody has come up why they do this is it's called a tidal, meaning the tides, tidal sorting hypothesis. And then if they've got a heavier propagule, and if you look at the red mangrove, it's definitely a larger, heavier propagule. It can be found in the areas that are closer to the water and that may get a little deeper and a little more inundation. So the heavier, bigger propagule can still manage to germinate and or it already germinate, but sprout and grow versus the lighter propagules such as the black and the white mangrove. They they need to be further up on the shore, so they're a little bit lighter. So I thought that was interesting. So why are mangroves important? They provide all sorts of beneficial activities. They filter runoff. They trap carbon in the peat so the carbon doesn't go into our atmosphere. We're going to talk about in the next couple of slides. Provide numerous animal habitats. They protect, probably one of the most important things, they protect land against flooding, especially during storms and rising seawater events. And then they improve water quality actually by filtering as water goes out into our estuaries. And then they reduce atmospheric carbon. They take in carbon and release oxygen. And then also nursery habitat, foraging habitat. I've got another slide that's a little better. But then in the entire life cycle of the mangrove killfish, mangrove tree crab, spotted mangrove crab, mangrove fiddler crab, and the American crocodile spend their whole entire life cycle amongst the mangroves. So again, mangroves are provide lots of wildlife habitat, wildlife cover for some species their entire life, and then some species just as a place to raise their young or a place to find food. So mangroves are also protected, and this is going to play, I think this is going to play more important in the future, but the state of Florida passed several years ago a mangrove trimming and preservation act. And it was basically because they realized how important mangroves were in protecting structures, protecting the coast, basically from storms and high tides and things like that. And so a lot of folks don't realize this, especially if they haven't lived with mangroves for a long time. And, you know, because mangroves are, I'll show you the kind of the secret. Mangroves are creeping up and they haven't had to deal with mangroves in the past. But um, to prune mangrove, you actually have to be a professional mangrove trimmer. And that's a process set up through the Department of Environmental Protection. And these folks possess the knowledge to trim mangroves that will mangroves are very they need to be pruned in a certain way. They don't take hard pruning very well. And so where that kind of clash comes in are these folks have properties on the coast and the mangroves kind of end up blocking their view. So a lot of times they just want to remove the mangroves, but now that we have professional mangrove trimmers, they can prune the mangroves in such a way where you can still get the view, but still have the mangroves. So what we started noticing in North Florida, oops, there we go, were that mangroves weren't a part of our ecosystems at all. If you can see, this is from, if anybody's been to St. Augustine, this is the Fort Castillo de San Marcos in St. Augustine in 1969, and this was the view. And it was salt marsh, primarily our estuaries were salt marsh ecosystems. But in 2018, as you can see, these yellow circles are primarily white, or excuse me, primarily black mangrove that started showing up more and more on the coast. This is actually me this weekend. I was hiking in northern St. Johns County in a place called Guana Talamato Matanzas National Marine Research Reserve. It's called GTM NER for short. And so just right along the intercoastal waterway, again, these are black mangroves, and you can kind of see their root system set up to be like little snorkels. So when they get inundated, the root systems can still get their oxygen. So this is where I licked the leaf. And so what mangroves have done is primarily expanded further north. So where historically, they were further south, they've kind of crept up all along up into Cedar Key, up in the Panhandle, and then on up into northern Florida. So even, and this was kind of unheard of, even red mangrove, which is the least cold tolerant mangrove. This is actually from the uh, Timucuan Preserve in between Nassau and Duval County, and it's a red mangrove taken by one of the naturalists there. And so I thought that was interesting as well. Where, well, I'll finish. I'll talk a little bit more. And so, basically, mangroves are expanding further north up the Caribbean or the Gulf of Mexico, and they're creeping further north along the Gulf of Mexico side, and then also the Atlantic. I want to kind of move on a little bit. And so also, as sea levels rise, that will also um, what it'll do is it'll force the mangroves to kind of come further and further up, um, higher and higher up inland, um, so that they can not be inundated with water. So, what this is the other thing with climate change in mangrove is our hurricanes, our storms are getting more frequent, more intense. And so this green area is historically where mangroves um, are. But as you can see in Florida, as the storms increase, it has the chance, it has the likelihood of doing more and more and more damage to the mangroves due to storm intensity. So that's just something we have to worry about and be careful of. Um, so the other, just two more things before we talk about associates and before we wind up. But I get this asked a lot whenever I talk about mangroves creeping up, and folks will say, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And so I don't know how to answer that question. The mangroves are replacing the salt marsh. And so is that good or is that bad? That's unfortunate. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing because they provide some of the same services that the salt marsh did. But I heard somebody ask this question. It was interesting. So what if we get, the mangroves have displaced the salt marsh, but what if we get an unnatural cold event that kills the mangrove? Then we'll have nothing. We wouldn't have mangrove and we don't have salt marsh. That's just an interesting conundrum to think about. But then also, as in Florida, we have the Mangrove Protection Act, but in Georgia, and so where this came from is they're actually looking in southern Georgia looking for mangroves, but there is no protection for mangroves in the state of Georgia. So does this mean that they'll have to enact some kind of rule for mangroves in Georgia? So just some of this was Savannah wanted to some of the associates that we'll see along with mangroves, marsh elder, wax myrtle we see quite commonly, and then saltbush is actually very common in the salt marsh along with mangroves. So this is what they look like, the stems, and then these are the leaves. And so that concludes my presentation, but I'm ready to answer any questions y'all might have.
Okay, I'm gonna toss them to you, Larry. Thank you. Really very interesting. So when we were talking about the shade cloth, the question would be, what would be best, 40 to 70, 50? And I'll ask you that, but to me, it really depends on what you're growing. I know that Bob Hockmuth's work with shade cloth for tomatoes is
Mhm.
interesting, and I think that they were, found different levels for different production. So I think that that would be something that is definitely worth investigating, and it would be plant specific. But if you want to comment on that too.
Yeah, I don't, this is kind of the extension, I don't know, but somebody will find out. It's
Yeah,
not me, but that's through current research, especially these things are changing now, so
yeah,
it's not like, well, it changed and we have to react to it. It's ongoing research and ongoing reaction now.
right.
So
Like one of our friends used to say, we're building the airplane as we're flying it here, right? So. And then you did comment on the migration of mangroves. I mean, have they seen them as far north as coastal Carolina yet?
I don't think so. They're looking, so that same researcher that was in front of the red mangroves, he was telling me that they are surveying southern. So right over the Georgia border is just
Myrtle
left
Beach, Charleston,
Cumberland Island.
Cumberland Island. Okay.
So they're surveying Cumberland Island and St. Mary's. They're surveying that for mangroves, and they haven't seen any yet there.
Okay. But they're watching, huh?
Yes.
And then Janice brings up a real good point is that even though we've been warmer, we've had these late freezes that come and mess up everything. So it happened in 2021, 2022. I had a real lot of damage from a St. Patrick's Day freeze in 2019. So it is kind of her comment is just that it's hard to predict. So
So that's one of the things that they talk about, and I kind of touched on it with the rain, is that the warm periods are warmer and the cold periods might even be that it's there's no the variations are no longer hills like this. They're hills like this. It goes hot and cold and hot and cold and wet and dry and wet and dry very extremely.
okay. So are these changes, are they affecting our trees, our already existing trees, or only the new ones that are not growing in those areas?
You brought it up yourself, even with flowering dogwood. Yeah, when you mentioned, I mean, I remember as a kid, I grew up in Florida. We had a dogwood in our front yard. And that was actually on the recommended trees for North Florida when I worked for the state forestry division. But with, there's a couple of different things going on. I imagine it's climate related, but powdery mildew has become a problem on dogwood when it never was a problem before. But then, we've always kind of been in the southern range of dogwood, but they're migrating, it's the trailing edge. When we think of leading edge and trailing edge, we may see some examples of dogwood in North Florida, but it's becoming harder and harder to grow them effectively. So yes, the trees that are existing, whether they are so the way I would kind of think of it, the trees that are more generalists that can grow in a wide variety of conditions probably do better. But the trees that have a specific niche that they need to be growing in, if it has anything to do with temperature, that wouldn't be. those are the trees that are being affected.
Okay, and so what about, we have a couple questions about the impacts to our agricultural products, fruits, vegetables, berries, how are we getting prepared for these changes?
So I think that's something the University of Florida is always trying to be ahead as far as research and giving folks new options. Um, like for instance, with way back when citrus canker was a problem, when I dream about, wish it was just citrus canker, you
Right,
know.
yeah. Now we, that
Yeah,
sounds
with
good now, right?
yeah, now with greening, but and with the freezes in 85, they started producing low chill peach cultivars so that if farmers that were growing peaches wanted to still produce some, or excuse me, farmers that were growing oranges wanted to produce a new crop, that perhaps low chill peaches. But now it's, they're always trying to give you options. Olives, um, um,
We talked about finger limes last year, things,
jujubes is one I
right?
saw in Suwannee County. Somebody was growing jujubes, persimmons. So I think it's just a matter, what's hard is for the farmer, if they've been producing something all their life a certain way, it's hard to adapt.
They got to change systems, it's a
Right.
whole, yep.
Yeah.
And then Mariana brings up that the wildlife and the insects and the diseases are changing as well, like you mentioned. Yeah. Um,
Not, we talk about invasive plants, but also invasive animals and insects as well.
yep. And then speaking of that, Vicky said, are they looking at animal and bird migrations changing, especially as it relates to birds eating berries or as dispersal agents for these plants too? So I don't know if you've noticed any of the literature for that or if folks are watching that.
Um, as a forester, I'm not as keyed in on it, but I do know that the migration times for birds have changed due to climate, and so they're getting to places where the insects haven't gotten there yet. They're used to get there when their food source was abundant. Now they're getting there earlier and the food source isn't necessarily as abundant. So those are just some of the things that, so yes, it's affecting plants, trees, wildlife, us.
Yep. So we do have a question about adjusting watering practices because the heat tolerant plants are suffering. I think that maybe this is a, what would Larry say to that? I have a feeling. Plant a tree.
Oh, so the heat tolerant plants for sure. Yeah, you have to. So maybe the Southwest aspect wouldn't be the place where you would, the heat intolerant plants. Maybe the Southwest aspect wouldn't be the place where you'd plant them, or to put tree cover, or even maybe not direct shade, but maybe something that would block some of the hot afternoon sun, but still, I always like to see things get the morning sun so they dry out, but protect them against the hot afternoon light.
Yeah, and someone dropped a link into the chat box about mangroves dying out as our sea temperatures rise, and of course they line the whole Caribbean and the impacts of that are going to be just huge as we lose that first line of defense for our hurricanes. Okay, this is getting depressing. And then talking about the mangroves as they relate to the estuaries and the fisheries, how that could also be a loss too. Yes, and Kathleen said, yeah, mangroves, help to protect those coastlines from storms. That's part of the reason why Florida even exists is because we have those mangroves protecting those islands and the barrier islands out there. Okay, someone says, along with many plants moving northward, we'd have to be aware of many insects are also on the move, whereas in past years, cold winters kept many species at bay. Now we're dealing with insects because they aren't getting killed off. So that's an interesting point too.
One of the things, just anecdotally, I it deals with like one of these new diseases, Texas, or excuse me, lethal bronzing. For years, we, in the first 10 years with lethal bronzing in palms, we had 3 trees with lethal bronzing. In the last 4 years, we've even taken down 6 just in our office with lethal bronzing.
Wow.
And so
Wow.
I think I never worried about it because I kind of thought things were too cold for the plant hopper to be here. But now
Mhm.
things are warmer. That plant hopper is here. And so, yes,
There's a
it's,
lot of ripple effects going
mhm.
on, right? Someone's noticed bald cypress dying. Any opinions of bald cypress going through the heat?
So I don't think it's heat. I think it's increased salt water because the seas are
Mm,
rising and that salt water is creeping more, is coming into the lakes more than, or excuse me, into the rivers more than it did.
yeah. And then someone noticing their redbud tree suffering. That's another.
That's one of those challenging, yeah, it's kind of going the same way as the dogwood. It's one
Mhm.
of those niche kind of things that it needs a moist, well-drained organic soil with not too hot.
Yeah. And then someone mentions that it seems like our publications are going to need to be updated as far as what our references are. So there's a little job security for us, Larry.
That's one of the reasons why the university updates their EDIS publications every, what is it, 5 years?
Mhm. Yeah.
And some of the EDIS publications have gone away that we're used to over, for a long, we've been used to having for a long time.
Yes, yes. And so, Larry, there were some actual tree questions for you that
Sure.
were in your jam. One was, how close should someone plant a tree to their house? I know it depends, but
So that's a, so that's kind of a, I'm going to say yes, there's an arboricultural answer for that, but then there's also a personal preference or a
okay.
personal, some folks don't want trees anywhere near the house where they could hit the house and fall on the house. So, because they're afraid of trees falling on their houses. However, well-maintained trees, pruned properly, actually shield your house from wind. So there's kind of what your tolerance is for, and then a lot of times I get these calls, insurance companies don't want any branches over the house. They tell people we're going to cut your insurance if you don't cut the branches. So that can be problems. I would say trees that are medium sized trees, maybe 15, 20, 25 feet away from the house. Bigger trees like live oaks, maybe 30 feet from the house. Um, there is, it's a great new publication. It kind of talks about sidewalks, how far away to plant trees from sidewalks. And that's based on kind of their root flare and how big that root flare gets. So it's a good kind of guideline for that. And it's got tables for different trees. You plant them different distances away from sidewalks.
Okay. And then someone is asking, what are some of the more deeper rooted trees for North Florida? Who's got deep roots?
So generally, roots grow where it's favorable for roots to grow. Duh.
No.
So if you're the limiting factor for roots growing deep is the oxygen in the soil. So if they can't breathe, they're not gonna, if they can't respire, they're not gonna grow. So soils with a high water table, soils with poor drainage, soils that are compacted are going to have a more shallow root system than drier, um, less coarse soil. But then added to that, most roots don't grow below 18 to 24 inches below the surface of the soil anyway. I don't want to say always because that's, somebody's going to come up with, well, I had a taproot that I had to take out 10 feet, but
Mhm.
generally 18 to 24 inches. So the key to that is give your trees plenty of room for them to have that full expanse growing space so they can put down as much roots as they can in that.
That's
If
a
it's a confined root area in a big tree, of course it's going to
mhm.
be less wind tolerant.
Really good response, Larry. As we're think about it, as we're paving, as we're building, as we're putting in that driveway, how is that impacting the roots being able to be as deeply rooted as possible, right?
One of the things, and tree ordinances are great, but they can be silly sometimes.
Yes.
In the city of Jacksonville, in Duval County, if you take out a live oak, you have to plant a live oak. So it's
Right.
inch for inch on live oak. And so it's very common. So you have these developers trying to find places to put live oaks in these developments. And they're right in the middle of these little patio homes with 30 by 30 front yard. And they're putting in a live oak, not even 30, but 20 by 20 front yard. And they're putting in a live oak that's never going to make it.
Right, right. So Larry, I mean, I'm seeing this too, where the county or the county codes are specing a full size tree, but for a sidewalk between a sidewalk and a house, and we've got about 8 feet of growth for them. And I'm almost thinking, specing smaller trees or even super big shrubs. You can get that shading there. So if you could try to make that happen, I would appreciate that. So everyone is thanking you for a wonderful presentation. But Barbara asked a really good question. What can we do going forward? And I think the best that we can do as master gardeners is to try to stay as educated as possible and like you observe what's going on. And what else would you say what we can do as educators?
So the key is, and it's just like everything, if you're at Thanksgiving dinner, the things you don't talk about are religion and politics, and lately it's been climate change as well into that. So it's just a matter of when somebody says something that's not accurate, gently, politely be aware of, know what the facts are, and so that you can point out things that are not truthful. Um, Vote,
Okay.
become educated, speak out.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right. And stay as educated and up to date as possible. And
yeah,
so I
yeah.
think
You
having
said that.
conversations like this and education like this is so helpful. So thank you, my friend. I can't believe I waited so long to get you on the webinar. So I'm happy to have you. And it was really great and a real eye opener for a lot of people. So
Thank
thank
you,
you so
Wendy.
much.
Appreciate it.
All right. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.